welcome to Mormons, Mystics, and Muons. And you want to introduce your podcast to River?
Yeah, thanks, Gabe. I have a podcast called, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, I Am Stupid. It's a reference to humility, but the branding was maybe a little bit shooting myself in the foot. Some people get it. But anyway, it's also a podcast largely about philosophical idealism, other such topics. But yeah, River Kanies, and yeah, stoked to be here.
Yeah, and I guess for your listeners, I am Gabe Prue, and yeah, I've got a podcast, Mormons, Mystics, and Muons. And I mean, start out talking more about Mormonism. That's the faith I was raised in. No longer a member, but kind of circled back in my journey and discovered a lot of the esoteric, likely psychedelic origins of Mormonism. So some of the episodes focus on that, but lately have done a lot more kind of science, spirituality, consciousness. Had Donald Hoffman and Bernardo Kastrup on recently. So yeah, that's my podcast. And so River, we can, do you want to talk about how we met each other?
Yeah. From my understanding, and correct me because I think I don't totally know how you came across my stuff, but my understanding is that it's sort of funny because I searched the terms like Bernardo Kastrup and Stephen Wolfram and found this guy who like helped edit my Essentia paper. And then I believe you told me that that's essentially how you found my work as well, which...
Yeah, I think I was probably 8 months ago or something. I think I had just read some of Stephen Wolfram's stuff on thermodynamics, which I don't actually remember how I went down that rabbit hole, or how I ended up to him from the thermodynamics rabbit hole. But anyway, yeah, I'd read some of his stuff and then saw the connections to Don Hoffman and Bernardo Kastrup, which I was much more familiar with. And so, one morning I woke up and I think I searched something like Ruliad and Bernardo Kastrup or Wolfram and Kastrup, and then found your interview on YouTube. And then, yeah, you were talking about, in this interview, you were talking about your paper that you had published. So, with the Essentia Foundation had published a paper that you had written, and that kind of inspired me to have that idea. And so I wrote something. So, do you want to introduce, I guess, Essentia Foundation and Bernardo Kastrup, and you can talk a bit about your paper, and then we can kind of summarize mine, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, for sure. So it's kind of a long story for me how I got around to writing that paper. It starts probably over 10 years ago when I first read Wolfram's book, A New Kind of Science. And that's when I really got introduced to cellular automata, and then a lot of the ideas that he's still talking about in his development of the physics project with the Ruliad and all that. So there's ideas of computational equivalence, computational irreducibility, and universality of these certain types of programs. So we could go down that rabbit hole a little bit at some point. But anyway, those ideas really clicked with me, and I felt like they gave me insight into a kind of a deeper, in some ways it was a deeper understanding, but it's interesting because in some ways they're very reductionist, right? Because we're talking about these programs, and so we're kind of looking at reality modeled in a way that it can be reduced to these really simple programs. But on the other hand, when you understand intuitively what computational irreducibility implies, it's basically this futility of the pursuit to have a perfect model that you can actually like use, right? Because it's computationally irreducible. Basically what it's saying is you can't perfectly model the universe without simulating the entire universe, like running the entire thing. And you can't have, a simulation inside of the universe that contains the universe, right? So that kind of allowed me to let go of this. Now I know it, I refer to it as logical positivism, but basically this idea that we could have a perfect model of everything and predict arbitrary things. It sort of forced me to accept that there would always be things we couldn't perfectly understand. And so without knowing it, the seeds of idealism had been planted in me at that point. And I sort of, over the past decade or so, kind of developed my own version of idealism. And then talking to people about my philosophy, eventually I was introduced to Kastrup's work, and I was like, this guy gets it. Like that, the idea that, the all life is a form of dissociated mind within a single God mind. Like that idea just clicked for me. And I was like, okay, now I know what my philosophy is called. It's called idealism, or analytic idealism, at least is the name Kastrup uses. So at that point, I had those two things, Wolfram's work and Kastrup's work. And I was like, these to me, like, link in a very big, important way. And I felt the need to express that and explain that. And so I wrote that essay, submitted it to Essentia, got rejected. They didn't understand Wolfram's terms at all. So I
Oh,
like
wow.
was so I went through another round, and I was like more careful about it to like explain this isn't irreducibility. This is computational irreducibility. It's a different thing. Because Wolfram's work is definitely paradigm shifting, I would say. It's definitely a whole different framing of things. But anyway, at that point, I wrote that essay. I ended up getting it published on the second submission, with help from Zinner, who is the guy who interviewed me, that video you found. And yeah, that's how you found me. So yeah, why don't you talk a bit about, take it from there, I guess.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I saw your interview and had some ideas that, I'd also been drawing connections between, you know, Hoffman and Castro, and they've had discussions, so that, that wasn't anything groundbreaking. But then, this is on I've got a couple episodes on this in my podcast, but I went through a bizarre paradigm shifting. I hesitate to use the phrase, but Kundalini awakening is like the Hindu concept. I hesitate to use the phrase because it doesn't have any like corollary to like scientific or logical, but basically, well, current, uh, Western psychology and like a material. So people aren't too familiar with that framework.
Johns Hopkins Institute or something. They have terms.
Yeah, I mean there is an interesting study.
They say a mystical experience is now a scientifically rigorously defined
thing. Right? Yeah, mystical experiences I think are becoming more accepted within science. Like Kundalini awakening is kind of a more specified, somewhat vaguely defined, but like a more aggressive and ungrounding experience over a shorter period of time, whereas other people like go through maybe a spontaneous spiritual awakening, but it's like a process of a few years where they, find this and that. I had a bunch of things shift in my life in a short amount of time. And so during that, I was having these like expanded states of consciousness, just endogenously. And essentially, I was talking to my brother about this yesterday. I had these experiences as I was going through divorce. I was getting into psychology and therapy and figuring out, my childhood and why I did the way things I did, and communication, how I viewed things. And started getting into meditation, philosophy. I would have these moments of, I'm curious if you had similar ones, where it felt like my brain went into a different gear than it had ever operated before. Like everything was so clear and like made sense. And I was like, oh my gosh, I was seeing like all these connections. But I couldn't stabilize them. And I remember one time I like made this voice memo of like all these like things that I was like putting together kind of philosophically. And then a few minutes later, like I was out of that state. And if you had asked me to like summarize what I had just said, it would have been really hard for me to uh, put it into words. And that's why I made the voice memo, because I was like kind of getting into these states and out of these states. And interestingly enough, like fear, shame, um, self doubt would be the thing that would like drop me out of these expanded states of consciousness or anything, or yeah, I guess that's what I call them. But anyway, I would have these, and they stabilized more and more as I got into them, thinking about these things and meditating and whatnot. But during that, I kept thinking about entropy and this kind of paradox of, we started from like the Big Bang and then everything's supposedly running down, but everything is also seeming to become more ordered in some sense. Yet the current narrative is that, oh, yeah, there can be local increases or local decreases in entropy, or like local increases in order, but only at the expense of global decreases in order. So, like, yes, there are things that are happening on the Earth, but that's because the sun is running down and overall, like, everything's going to go to this heat death. And so there's something that I thought often about during this and knew there was something there, but I couldn't really put my finger on it. And so I kind of shelved it and just kept going through this process. And then like half month, year later, I was diving more into physics. My background, I'm a dentist, but I had a computer science minor and bioinformatics bachelor's degree. So I'm just fairly familiar with hard science stuff. And so I'd watch some physics videos from Sabine Hassenfelder, I think is her name. She was pretty popular physics. She's a materialist though, and she and Kastrup, I guess, go back and forth on things. But she had an interesting video about how she doesn't believe entropy, and she kind of dismantled entropy from a materialist perspective. And I thought that was interesting and fit with what I was thinking about. And then I was thinking about Hoffman's stuff, and he had also made some comments on how entropy is really just an artifact of this downsampling, or this projection, he calls it, of these Markovian dynamics, kind of this deeper fundamental reality that doesn't have entropy. But if you project it, which I think is sort of like a shadow, and like Plato's cave analogy, where if you're seeing a shadow of something that you're not seeing the deeper nature of it, you lose a lot of information. So I saw that, and then I had somehow stumbled upon Wolfram's work, and he talks a lot about entropy and from a computational model. Yeah, he also says that essentially entropy is an artifact of the observer, the computational bounds of the observer. And so I didn't see anybody else putting those all together. And so I wrote a paper and submitted it to the Essentia Foundation, and then it got, I didn't know if they'd published it at first, and then they published it, and then it became, I guess, the most popular essay last year, and they had asked me to write a book on it. And so that's what I'm working on now. But yeah, it's interesting. Even though several people had talked about entropy, I think the difference, what I haven't seen really anybody talk about, is the idea that not only is entropy an artifact of our computational bounds or limitations as observers, but specifically that those computational bounds aren't fixed. And I don't know, have you seen any because Wolfram talks about computational bounds and he really, he has it really well defined, but he doesn't. And he talks about how if you had different computational bounds, like if you were thinking about what reality would be like for a planet, it would be very different than what it would be like for a human, just because of the distances and how fast light travels and stuff. So he makes distinctions about how reality would be different and the laws of physics would be different, and there are kind of emergent properties of computational bounds, but nobody talks about, yes, you can change them. And in my essay, I kind of talked about how meditation, psychedelics, just even the process from like a baby being born, you think about the entropy that they experience too when they start to be able to label items and understand things, like they're experiencing a decrease in entropy because their computational bounds are increasing. So I don't know, have you,
Yeah,
what you've come
yeah. I mean,
across?
definitely like, so there's like the standard scientific take on entropy, which is sort of what you started with there, which is basically, I mean, it's really pretty nihilist if you take it seriously, like this idea that we have this big bang and we're going towards a heat death. It's definitely it sows the seeds of nihilism if you take that too seriously. Um, so there's that, and I think it's great to approach the topic because of that. Because I mean, obviously, there's something more to talk about there for sure. If your metaphysical conclusion is nihilism, then I would say maybe take a second look at it. You have nothing to lose. um, but it's kind of funny because there's this recent trend, the EAC movement. It's like a Twitter thing. Lex recently had the kind of founder guy who goes by Beth Jesus. It's a whole ironic thing, pretty much. But um, they have a bit of a different take, which is more of a white pill take. Like, we are, doing God's work by increasing entropy, and there's like this greater purpose to it or whatever. And it's kind of silly, but at the same time, I think that's closer to being right than the nihilist take, for sure. But like, so if we look at what entropy is and why would we get to that conclusion that the nihilists take? Well, it's basically like thermodynamics is really useful, right? And we have these really simplified models for modeling thermodynamic systems, and they involve energy loss due to entropy, right? So there's this very practical accounting for, energy conservation, sort of math, physics, thermodynamics calculations going on. And I have a background in mechanical engineering, by the way. So this is like, I spent years doing this. So we have very practical reasons for like kind of having that take of entropy is only ever created. Kind of, that's not actually true, but that's sort of like the standard first order interpretation anyway. And so if you extrapolate that out, we're looking at the universe, and there's like this heat death interpretation of things. But even in Wolfram's model, with the Ruliad, it's sort of this Big Bang esque sort of thing where it's start with something small and then expand infinitely in all directions, kind of. But this is a computational space of calculating, and so I think it's been a long time since I've looked at any of his takes on thermodynamics. But I'm very familiar with like his Ruliad work and his observer sort of work, and I think you kind of end up in there's a lot of ways you can end up going that same direction, and I don't think Wolfram really takes a strong philosophical stance on things, which is sort of what my paper was about, is like putting a philosophical take on some of his work from my perspective. But I think like without that take, you can go either way. You can go the basically the same as the materialist way, even looking at the Ruliad. If you think it expands infinitely, or if you think it's all pre-computed, which to me gets sort of to the eternalism question, that can have a nihilist interpretation, or you can go the other way with it.
So have you read his stuff this year on thermodynamics?
As
Because
of this
or
month, you mean?
last year.
Okay. I don't know that I have.
Okay, because
When I think of Wolfram, I don't think of thermodynamics, but I know
okay,
I've heard him mention it. It's just like not the thing that I think about.
yeah, because he, you know how he talks about things. He's super thorough and detailed, which is amazing. But also like I think the difficulty with it is that it's hard to crystallize and or other people I think are important to distill and draw philosophical and everyday applications from what he says. But yeah, so earlier last year, beginning of last year, he posted a 3-part, very long. Well, he published them as books, and one or two of them are in YouTube videos. But he basically was like, "I figured out thermodynamics, and I've been working on this for 40 years from back when I was like a teenager." He's been thinking about it that long, and he was close back then, but it wasn't until the computational irreducibility and the Ruliad stuff lately that he's like, I figured out what thermodynamics is, what quantum physics is, what relativity is, statistical mechanics. It's all falls under this computational irreducibility. And so, yeah, it might be, well, I mean, I think if you read my paper, I think I sum it up pretty well, but it's very, I mean, one of the papers, one of the books, he just talks about the history of thermodynamics, and another one he talks about his history with it, and then the other one he kind of dives into it. But yeah, I think so. In terms of like the Big Bang and the computational space, I think what I've been thinking about lately, and specifically when I heard Michael Levin talk to Kastrup the other day about morphospace, I think is what he called it. Basically, Michael Levin's working on how cells go through morphogenesis and that they're essentially exploring morphospace, which he defines as like the space of all possible anatomic configurations.
Right.
I think that the Ruliad is best conceptualized as this infinite space, computational space of all conscious experiences. And that the Big Bang, as well as like the thermodynamic heat death of the universe, they're just sort of placeholders in it, symbolic placeholders where, and that's this, I think this explains the difference of these cosmological models of, is it just one Big Bang that's expanding, or is it a cyclical universe? Which I think the Hindu tradition is like, it's a cyclical universe where like God gets bored or something and he destroys everything and then starts again. Or I'm not too familiar with it, but there is a correlation, I think, between the Hindu tradition.
I'm a big fan
And
of boredom myths.
yeah,
Boredom. I think is really important to contend with, and I think a lot of people, have a gut reaction to be a bit dismissive about it. But we can go deep into that one if you care to.
yeah, but I think it's interesting to talk about what the useful meanings of why the one dissociated or whatnot. But
Yeah,
but yeah, the Big Bang, I think. So I think the Ruliad, you can conceptualize it as like a database, and our conscious experiences, our life, basically just different queries on the database, and we're just iterating through these different experiences. And a lot of what he talks about, it's interesting. I listened to Wolfram's interview with Lex Friedman, and he's talking about this computation irreducibility and how like to tackle that. You can use these multi-threaded processes essentially, and recursion. And so, really all we know is that we're experiencing something. We have consciousness, which I define as just experiencing. Um, and time, in terms of entropy, is time is created by entropy, and entropy is this, it's kind of this just going through different permutations. And I think you explore a branch and then you get finished with that branch and you kind of pop up the stack. So I think viewing the Ruliad as like the computational space of all conscious experiences, the Big Bang would be like just zooming out and looking at everything. Whereas you can zoom in and you can like hypothesize the conscious experience that your cells could be having. Or as he does, you could hypothesize like what consciousness would be like for a planet. And so time, like according to Hoffman, and I think it really makes sense, like time, space, they're not fundamental. They're computational hacks of us iterating through this difficult infinite space. So that's what I think.
I have a bit of a different take on the Ruliad, which to me, and I have notes on your paper on that section where you talk about Wolfram's work right here. So I'd be happy to get into that a bit. But let me go ahead and start by just touching on my paper a little bit. So the kind of my argument that I make in my essay that got published by Essentia is that if we take this like Ruliad model seriously, if we take Wolfram's work seriously, we end up kind of hitting this wall of transcendence, like this kind of, there are limitations for how much we can know, right? Basically, when you look at universality, you can see that no matter how deep you probe into the reductionist kind of patterns that we can analyze and make sense of, if you were to find some fundamental program, there's no way to know that that's actually the fundamental one. Mm-hmm. There can always be a deeper one that makes arbitrary changes at higher levels, right? So what I was really trying to do there is just kind of show, it's almost like a Gödel's incompleteness theorem, where I'm just showing that this is incomplete. There's another side to this. And I don't do this in that paper, but I talk about this often. This is where I would invoke Ian McGilchrist, because he does the best job, in my opinion, of anyone's work that I've looked at explaining paradox and specifically this sort of left brain, right brain role, and really just an interpretation of of reality through that, where we have these patterns, right? The Ruliad is the patterns, but that's only half of the story. That's only ever half of the story, and in some sense, it's the less important half. So, McGilchrist talks about that as being the left brain, at least for most people anyway. It's like one hemisphere is focused on the patterns and trying to like very consciously analyze things. The other half is almost like an antenna to the God mind or something. It just has divine sparks. It has intuition. Like that's where creativity comes from. Like these things that are a bit inevitable, but really are at the heart of everything we care about most, is coming from this other half. And that's not really addressed directly at all by anything, by any of Wolfram's work. So, for example, when, and I don't mean to be putting words in your mouth here, but in your paper, you're talking about, and this actually might be coming from Wolfram, of basically conscious beings as existing within the Ruliad. To me, I would say my paper is arguing something very different than that. It's arguing that the Ruliad exists within a consciousness, and that consciousness is greater and transcends the patterns that are the Ruliad. The Ruliad is to me, in my understanding, is only the patterned half. It's not the rest of consciousness. So to me, if I were to, talk about conscious beings existing within the Ruliad, these observers, I would say those are connection points where this greater mind is sort of reaching into the Ruliad and having an effect that's beyond just the patterns that are happening in that Ruliad. There's something transcending that as well. Basically, the way I think of it is you have this universal mind, and I'm invoking Castrop here, this God mind sort of thing that's dissociating into all these observers. And the observers in the Ruliad are the forms that are taken and that the observers see each other as, right? This is the interface that, a brain is what a conscious being looks like, sort of thing. So that's kind of how I make sense of all that. But
So I think I agree with you. I think the way I conceptualize it, and I've heard you talk about like this balance between order and chaos, which is, I think, at the heart of this, left brain, right brain construct versus experience.
For sure.
And yeah, so I would view, in terms of us existing within the Ruliad, this comes down to your definition of self and what an observer is and who you define yourself as being in it. And I think I love Alan Watts and how he, kind of disabuses of us of how confident we are that like we're a self. So I would say that the Ruliad is sort of this infinite space of possibility, and that observers exist within it, in as much that an observer is just a slice of it, one perspective of it from within it. And from whatever perspective you have, it will look at the rest of the Ruliad and it will observe the Ruliad from that slice. So again, kind of back to the database and the query thing. So you got the database, the Ruliad, and then the observer is the query. So you've got all this information. Like, I'm interested in seeing what all the, I'm a dentist. You've got the database. I want to see all the patients that have had this procedure done. So you do a SQL query, you instantiate an observer, you slice it, you organize that data in some way. You can change that. Well, I want to see all the patients that, I want to see all the procedures that I did on this day. So there's infinite ways to slice it. And so being an observer, I think observers are really just slices of the Ruliad, ways of experiencing it. And that's where our time comes in, is that we consider ourselves as persistent in time. And Wolfram talks about this, but when you think of, like, where would you say the past exists? Like, would you say, do you think that the past, what would you say? Like, what's your concept of the past and the future?
Let me step back from this for a second, because this is a big topic. Because we're getting into basically the eternalism versus presentism debate a little bit here. So I think it's a powerful metaphor you just laid out with the database, and an observer is basically querying it. However, to me, the kind of practical takeaway from all this philosophy is intuition that can like help guide day-to-day decisions. So to me, I think it's a bit unsatisfying to land on an eternalist model or anything where we're saying this is a database, because you're missing, and again, you're not missing that entire half of the creative side, but to me, the eternalist framing kind of dismisses the generative aspect of being part of this God mind who's generating reality. It's an active thing. It's happening in time from the perspective of us as humans anyway. And so I think that time is it's not what we think of it as in space-time, but I think there is something analogous to time that is essentially fundamental. And maybe it's a causal chain, like invoke Hoffman for a second here, causation between conscious agents, right? If we I think any model we have that has real explanatory power is going to have something effectively equivalent to time. Now, it may have little bits of time travel, it may have quantum effects, it may have different sorts of things that seem really unintuitive, but the point I'm getting at is just that the generative aspect is so crucial to me. In terms of philosophical takeaways from idealism, I think one of the most valuable things is gaining that deep intuition that you are actively playing a role as part of the God mind in generating the next layer of reality, essentially. And what you're doing does actually matter and does have meaning. So that's where, for me, I'm always going to argue against kind of eternalist
What do you mean
interpretation.
by eternalist? I'm not too familiar with the different philosophical terms.
Well, I'm not super familiar with the idea of eternalism either, but just to me, like the block model or like calling the Ruliad a database, to me, it's like it sort of suggests the data is already there, and that's what I'm saying. Like, okay, it's a database in the sense that it's a mind, like it's within a mind, but again, like to me, the Ruliad is just a pattern. So like the mind is beyond that. The database is only part of it, and it's a living database that's constantly being updated. At least that's how I think I think that's a more useful framing in terms of practical
So,
takeaways.
so yeah, I agree. Yeah, real quick, something you said, and I think this is helpful in grokking this stuff. Are you familiar with photogrammetry? Just the idea of like a bunch of 2D perspectives. You stitch a bunch of 2D photos together and you can create a 3D photo, even though you don't have a 3D scanner.
Sure. Yeah.
So I think that's, one of the best models of understanding the models of reality where, we are taking a perspective. You say you just have two-dimensional photos of an object. And let's pick a coin. You got a two-dimensional photo of a coin, and you've seen the heads side of that coin, and all you know is that there's two dimensions. You don't know anything more. And yeah, for sure, it's heads. And then you hear somebody else saying, it's tails. You're like, no, that's crazy, because I see it. I have all the information here. It's heads. And then for some reason, you switch perspectives in life. You have a faith crisis and you leave religion or something. And then you see the tails side and you're like, oh no, now I see tails. And people have two different, I think, ways of coping with this. Some people say, oh yeah, I was wrong. Everything about that previous perspective was wrong. I was in error. I'm going to throw that out and I'm just going to focus on this tail side. So they still stay in this kind of like absolutism of truth. Other people, it's like all relativism. I was like, well, it's heads for me, it's tails for you. Like there's no truth. It's just individual truth. But then maybe you get somehow shifted to the side view of it and you just see this like thin slice and you're like, what the hell is that? And then eventually the more of these two-dimensional views, if you can, instead of throwing out data, if you can kind of suspend your disbelief and just aggregate data over and over again, even though they're just two-dimensional slices and they're paradoxical, eventually you pop into this deeper, you pop into you grasp the three-dimensional picture of it and you're like, yes, from the two-dimensional perspective, all of those views are veridical. They're true within those constraints. But this is the more true perspective. And some of those views are more helpful than the others in kind of grokking that 3D image. And then you realize, well, this goes on to infinity, because then if you take all the three-dimensional views, somehow you pop into 4 dimensions. And because I don't think time as a fourth dimension is the most accurate. But I was thinking the other day, like, this is what we do, like, all day, every day. Like, we see in 2 dimensions. Like, we have two-dimensional images because we have 2 eyeballs. It is our nature as observers, I think, to take lower dimensional things, take 2 different perspectives, slightly different perspectives, and then we stitch them together and extend ourselves, and we, edge into that chaos to create order of it. Same thing with our hearing. We're hearing in 2 channels, but we're stitching it together. And that is going to Levin's, I think, this individual self and then the collective self. The individual selves have their knowledge, but then collectively they have an identity as a self, and then they have their knowledge that can't be actually fully known by the cells, the body. So that's, I think that's a really good model for all the models of reality, is realize, like, okay, these are all, we're thinking in 2 dimensions, we're thinking in 1 dimension, trying to describe something in the next dimension. So we figure out what is good from this view, like, what is this view useful, but also understanding that it's a downsampling of
I mean, I think we're getting into, like, really the meat of some really interesting stuff here, because I mean, paradox, it's one of those things that philosophically you have to be able to contend with, and practically I think it's one of the most powerful things to do as well. So specifically, like, the paradox of suffering, and this all relates to big questions of, dissociation. Why did the God mind dissociate in the first place? What's the value of limitations? That's directly related to paradox, right? Why are there 2 perspectives if actually the real perspective is to take both of those and combine them? Well, and I'll invoke McGilchrist again here, because he makes it very clear with examples, and I highly recommend looking at his work, that all 3 perspectives are valid. So there's a multiplicity of seemingly contradictory, but all valid perspectives. And that's what a paradox is. It's not a contradiction. It just looks like a contradiction from any one perspective. But there's a necessity and a validity to that multiplicity. And I think if you extrapolate that out, that gets to the big dissociation question, I would say, which is, it's not why would the God mind dissociate into the multiplicity of humanity, but it makes it intuitive that makes sense to do that, because when we recognize these paradoxes everywhere, and we recognize how meaning is created in our lives, how we develop it through suffering, and that's paradoxical, we can get to that. We see these paradoxes and we see that we're contending with them, then we start to recognize how necessary suffering and limitations more generally are, to that context in which meaning is realized. And then then the question gets inverted and becomes, how could the God mind, if not dissociated and completely limitless, totally omniscient, omnipotent, how could it develop meaning when it doesn't have these limitations, this context in which we as humans are able to realize meaning? And I think that really, those questions really get to the heart of it.
Yeah. And I want to get into meaning in a moment, but I think, I agree with you that the creativity, like, it's still there in the database example.
There's like a coder.
The creativity, you're the coder. Yeah, you're the coder.
Right, that's what
like, for me, another example of this is, like, I feel like it's you're watching a movie, and you've been watching a movie, for your whole life, and you're just kind of stuck with, it's like a first person movie, and you're just seeing from the eyes of a character, and then all of a sudden you, like, find a remote next to you, and you realize, like, oh, I can change the zoom. Like, this isn't, I thought this was on autopilot, but I can actually zoom out, and then I see that character, and I can choose, do I want to follow that? Or you can actually explore this whole it's not a movie anymore. It's actually just a 3-dimensional space that it's gaining, de-identifying yourself from the ego and an individual, and realizing, oh, I'm the awareness that is viewing this person's life, and I'm a dissociated or a recursive process in a infinite algorithm exploring this space. Another example, I think, is it's like it's an infinite choose your own adventure book where, I throw this choose your own adventure book in front of you. All the stuff's there, but the way you can't just download it into your brain, and you wouldn't want to, because it's just all the timelines mushed together. So you're going to read it one page at a time. That's time. And then you keep reading them, and then you can go back and you can explore, well, I really like that one story, that one way of reading this book. And I think that's the free will, is that you don't have a free will as River or Gabe. You have a free will of the awareness that is exploring these different timelines or ways of slicing or rendering this infinite permutation, this database of permutations of conscious experiences.
Well, I think to me that this makes me think of like mystical experiences, because for me, that's how it's because I've experienced that state of being time and time again and seen this pattern play out, that is so intuitive to me. Because when I've been in the state many times where I feel like I'm not River, I'm not this person. I know that, I kind of was inhabiting that, and I will again, whatever. But like, I'm not an I'm not even a self. I'm just like in this state where I really feel that I am, one with something more universal. But then you get to a point where you're bored, but it's not a shrugging thing. It's like I actually want to experience the beauty of life that comes with that hardship. I know that all comes together, and it's been great to be in this moment of bliss and peace and feeling that unity and all that. But at some point, it does get boring, and that's not a trivial thing. I mean, boredom is not trivial, and so you do get to a point where you're just like, okay, throw it at me. I'll embrace the chains again, and I'll struggle through it. And I think, like, for me, that usually indicates some sort of a breakthrough. Like when I can come back into my egoic self, but be just filled with a sense of optimism and purpose, and like that creative energy is just flowing through me, and I'm ready to embrace the challenges, because that's what it is. It's embracing the challenges. It's not having things go so well, and it's not winning the lottery. It's about embracing the challenge. That's where you find the meaningful things.
Yeah. And I think, boredom's a thing. But decoupling yourself, re-identify. This is all about self and how you define self. And my path started with like Sam Harris, who I diverged philosophically at some point with him, but he's beautiful at just like destroying your idea that you're a separate self with an ego. And you realize like, oh, my ego, my sense of self is like a clump of thoughts. It is, you are a self, because that's a database query that exists. But you're not the query, you're the coder. And so you're trying out query after query, and you're just changing a term each time. And that's what we're experiencing. And that's where, I think this idea of time and the past and how it exists is useful, because in all I learned about psychology and people and nonviolent communication particularly really deconstructed and reconstructed this for me. I think back to my childhood. I've changed time. I've like rewritten the past, because everything I remember now, I interpret it in a whole new context. You can have two people go through very similar experiences, and you can have two people experience the same marriage, experience the same family, but they have two different pasts that they remember. So like the past exists, but it exists in all of our individual memories. And these are kind of like all the different two-dimensional perspectives. And like the true past, it's how we interpret how we got to this very moment through the physical world around us. Like, why am I sitting in this chair talking to you? Through like, if you want to take a materialist perspective, the neurons, the synapses, or whatever. But this is what I like Bernardo was talking about with Levin, of like, we're constantly rewriting the past individually. He said, but I think that there really is a past that does exist somewhere. Yeah, I mean, it exists because it's kind of a query. It's a way of slicing the Ruliad. But I think the problem with this, and it's not much of a problem, but it's the same problem people have with idealism. Of like, oh, there's no objective reality. Well, like this table between us really exists. Like, I know it's there, it's there. They have a hard time having an explanation for a consensus reality. But that really isn't a problem if you look at dreams and if you look at dissociative identity disorder. And that was mind blowing when I first heard Bernardo talk about, oh yeah, you've got dreams. I already thought about how dreams are like, when this is idealism, you have one mind, one consciousness, goes to sleep. A part of that consciousness that your perspective as the coder, you're following that. The camera's following the avatar because that's what you remember when you wake up. But all the other stuff that's happening in your dream, they're from other parts of your brain or your mind, if you want to take a materialist perspective. So you dissociate, you experience the rest of the mind, and then you've experienced matter and space and time. You're sure that it's real. If somebody else told you that, oh, this matter only exists from consciousness, you're like, no, like I'm touching it. That doesn't make sense. But then sure enough, you wake up and you reassociate. And then he talks about, you have people with dissociative identity disorder that due to trauma, they have these different alter egos. Some of them, when they dream, as when they ask the different alters to recall the dream, they recall the same dream from a different character's perspective in the dream. But there is a consensus reality. Like, there is truth. It's just the summation of all the different perspectives, all the two-dimensional views. You get to the three-dimensional truth.
The reinterpretation of time comes with the frame shifting from a reductionism, basically, because in a reductionist interpretation of things, time is this linear thing where, I mean, let's just go full materialist for a second. It's like particles randomly bouncing in a void, and wherever this particle happened to, wherever that butterfly happened to bat its wing, it ended up causing a storm over here or whatever. Like, there's this perfect causal chain, and we're kind of helplessly swimming in this void, just, being assailed by our environment at all times. And like, it's all these random forces, right? When you shift into a idealist framing or other framings, things become very different. Time becomes very different because you start to recognize, when you understand reality as existing within a mind and ask, what does that mean, what does that imply, you start and ask these questions like, what is truth, what is ground truth? Like, a lot of people feel like the objective reality just got ripped out from under them if they even start to think about that. But there are truths, there are patterns time and time again that we can see. And the most intuitive way to make sense of these patterns is just by looking at our own experience and having that be a metaphor for the God mind, essentially. And so when we start to see these patterns again and again, we start to see these buffering mechanisms. There's an adaptive nature to things. As a conscious being, we adjust to our environment. We adjust based on our expectations. We're getting to relativity now, and relationality. Things only exist within a context, and they only take meaning because of the network of relations that they exist within. So when you start to see that there's these sort of cyclical aspects and all these patterns, all these buffering mechanisms, all this, everything's adapting. People's experiences are defined by this relationality, all these things. It really completely changes what time means. Time is no longer, the particles the universe has expanded more. We're one step closer to the heat death or whatever. It's like the story is evolving and it's changing, and you're part of creating that next layer. And there's no clear limits based on the past. The past doesn't really have any hard, clear limits for what the future holds, but it does kind of guide, at least the pattern section of it is sort of guided by the patterns that we're looking back at. So it's a way of sort of making sense of where we are, right? Looking back to the past, but also looking to the future. We're actively generating the future, and we can't make assumptions based off the past that limit the future. So once you really see that, then time becomes a different thing. The past becomes a different thing. Like, these aren't hard, rigid things you can't do anything about, because you're always doing something about them. You're part of this mind in which all of that was created and is constantly changing.
Yeah, I think you should. I just listened to Wolfram on Brian Keating's podcast, and they're talking about this stuff. And like, this is what, Wolfram talks about. Time is the exploring of different permutations of like the Rulial space or whatever. Or actually, Wolfram, I think where I disagree with him is that he's still sort of stuck in materialism, but his monad now is like Rulial particles or something like that. Instead of, it's these particles of space that interact with each other. But he's still talking about the same. He's on the right track though when he's talking about time being the it's the iteration through permutations of the Ruliad. I think another example, I don't know why I think in examples, but like, it's like a puzzle. You've got this 1,000-piece puzzle, you dump it out on the table, it's chaos. You have to have a certain strategy to go about it, to put it together. So I'm going to find the border pieces, I'm going to find the pieces that are grass, whatnot. You have a strategy, you develop a model to tackle it. And I think that's what space and time are these ways of splaying out this infinite data set into ways that we can explore it. So we're going to use these different dimensions to put the puzzle pieces out on the table so that we're not overwhelmed by it. So we've got enough chaos, so it's fun to play, but we've got enough order that we can actually make progress through it. So, this information, I think from Hoffman's perspective, what we see as physical matter, it's mapped to some deeper information, I think is a decent, and I think information is best defined as like just relationships. I think it does come down to relationships. If everything's one, information is just the relation from one subpoint to another subpoint. So this is, if you view this, with this VR headset thing too, in the VR headset, everything you're seeing, you can map it to some computational process or whatever in the computer that we're all jointly playing on.
Well,
so in three-dimensional space, like, there are certain things I've mapped over to Russia, to Antarctica. It's just not that important to me, and I'm not going to render it. It's just placeholders. They're just data structures I don't really use. But then we have other stuff that is pretty persistent, like my body. I've mapped it to my body, and that's where I think this kind of the psychosomatic, or like the connection between mind and body is important, because there's definitely something going on. So we've mapped some to body, to our body, or to people that exist in our life. And then we also, time is another hack, instead of experiencing all at once, like, I'm going to iterate through all these different possibilities, changing one thing at a time. That's why we have this kind of persistent view of ourselves, even though from a materialist perspective, we're a new set of emergent consciousness magically popping into existence like every moment. But how does that all get linked together as like a continuous experience? So I do view it as, I think computational is really a helpful model. I think going back to like what you said earlier, why we use kind of the reductionist thing, I think where a computational view of reality is helpful is because, typical reductionism, to my understanding, is just we're going to break it to smaller pieces. Eventually, we'll get to the fundamental building block and we'll figure it all out. But that's crazy because you'll never get somewhere that you haven't defined through language.
Yeah. It's one of those cycles. So like, talking about time and these patterns and stuff, it's like we're in a materialist cycle. We're in a reductionist cycle. People, this was not the standard forever, right? It's only been arguably since Newton and Descartes, you could say, that we got like this most recent kind of big wave of kind of materialism. And what materialism is doing is it's dodging the big questions. It's kind of trying to ignore consciousness. It's saying, oh, we'll figure out how consciousness can emerge from matter at some point. But for now, just trust us. It's all particles in a void. And then now we can make up arbitrary, assumptions built off of that. But when you start to really look at chaos and order and like recognize that as being a fundamental property of consciousness itself, of this God mind, this is something that doesn't go away. It cycles. Then you start to see that like that's really only an illusion we cast for ourselves, because as we try to take control of our internal models through reductionism, for example, you get a lot of like really valuable tools, right? Like we've been able to do really practically valuable things, but the more control you gain over a system that you fundamentally don't control, which is the case, the more kind of corruption seeps into that system. And then eventually the chaos force kind of will take over and implode. So I think like one of the current versions of this kind of playing out is quantum mechanics. What does that term mean? Well, if we look at Wolfram's interpretation, he's like, oh, now that I have this hypergraph Ruliad thing, I've explained quantum mechanics kind of. Okay, but that doesn't account for true chaos, though. So what he's actually talking about is only the patterns that we've started to gather from quantum mechanics, from our interpretation. So if we say, okay, there's two branches of physics, general relativity, quantum mechanics, and the grand goal, the grand logical positive goal is to unite these two things. Well, once you do that, what you'll realize is those pop over into the left brain and chaos creates a new thing over here, which is the part of quantum mechanics that you weren't contending for, and is what I'm trying to get at personally when I talk about quantum mechanics, because I think our understanding is still rough enough that there's something there, and we're still kind of talking about it. But there is this materialist temptation to say, oh, once we get the math figured out, then that'll go away and we'll have it all figured out. That's not how it works, because fundamentally, any model you make is just a tiny little slice inside of this Ruliad, let's call it, right? Mm-hmm. And the Ruliad is computationally irreducible. So it's essentially infinitely more complex than any model you can ever build of it. So no matter how perfect your unification of quantum mechanics and relativity are, there's going to be this next thing that we haven't contended with yet. And that's great. I mean, that means that's what life goes on. The adventure isn't over.
Yeah. I think so. Like where the computational view improves on reductionism is literally taking it's not construct aware. It's like atoms are a thing. Like, no, atoms are a thing we made up to call a certain phenomena when we're measuring it a certain way. And yeah, I love, Bernardo Castro described just kind of the fallacy in this idea that like, if you describe something, you're always going to use something else to describe it. Like a tissue is made of cells, cells are made of, molecules, etc. So like it's very easy. It should be very easy to realize like, we'll hit a wall with reductionism, because the things aren't real themselves. They're only there when we define something, and words only have meaning in as much as they're shared meaning between other people. Computation is like, oh, these are just pointers, these are just variables. I can actually try to figure out, there's some algorithmic patterns that I'm seeing in this, and it's playing out at this level, it's playing out at this level. And so yeah, I think it's like trying to copy, trying to recreate a picture of the Mandelbrot fractal, and you're doing it pixel by pixel. And then at some point you're like, this is really hard. And you're like, oh wait, instead of like really trying to figure it out this way, there's a formula that there's like a deeper reality. But I do like what you said in your paper too, that there is some aspect that the patterns there are these patterns that happen throughout all of the different Zoom levels. But there is some aspect that pattern changes depending on the level that you're looking at. So, I do.
Time.
What's that?
That's what time is that change in the pattern at levels in a way. Like that's an interpretation of time.
Well, I think time is like, so I think using like a recursive process, like a sorting algorithm or like solving a maze or whatever computational terms, if you say, hey, I've got a method I'm going to call whenever you get to a right left branch, call yourself on both of those branches and then keep processing, and then they'll get to different branches and then call yourself. So then you've got a stack of calls where like there's the main method, and then it has two methods that it's called, and they're all running. Eventually they, in a non-infinite scenario, but like eventually those sub processes find the end of the maze or whatever, and then they'll start returning their calls. And then once you have the data from that set, you're like, okay, now I can piece together what this next level of the stack is and the next level. So I think that's where like the time, there is this nature where we do see entropy seem to increase, and then you hit some breakthrough. Societally, we hit a breakthrough. We create new instruments that can measure further, and then entropy decreases because now we've reduced some of that information gap. In your life too, like you've thought about how your parents treated you a certain way until you go to therapy and you're like, oh my gosh, like now I see the patterns of why they did what they did, and that's what their parents did to them. And then again, you decrease this entropy, you order what was chaotic to you in a new model that makes more sense. And so I think there is some method of like, there's this exploring, putting the puzzle pieces together for the grass, and then you're like, okay, I'm done with that. I'm going to like dump some more pieces out and work on another part. So you explore kind of at one level of the stack, and then you can switch as awareness. I think it's important to decouple yourself from like a human, but you're just an awareness experiencing this level of the stack right now. And it's all happening simultaneously. Like from a materialist perspective, if human consciousness is just magically popping into existence because of a certain conformation of atoms and neurotransmitters and information exchange, cells are having ion channels and voltages and information exchange, communicating with neighbors. So what's to say that cells aren't having a conscious experience too, even from a materialist perspective? The whole earth, you see humans working, interacting with each other, driving on roads, like we're just a bunch of neurons. And there is some way to try to imagine the earth as a consciousness, but we're just doing it from a human perspective. So you do have to realize that there is that limit, that we're going to filter everything from our way of interpreting things.
Well, I think I want to touch on AI here because I feel like this quantum question gets to it. Like, one way to phrase the question would be like, will well what is everybody scared about? That's a good place to start. People are scared, a lot of people are scared of there being some sort of runaway effect with these AI systems we're developing, right? So I think we're in a place philosophically where we could try to, ask that question and take stabs at answering it a little bit. So I think, looking at quantum, to me, there has to be at least some aspect of that in anything conscious, because if if we're operating within our standard models of physics, that's kind of the spot where that divine spark, that creativity, that intuition can come in, that we have some sort of physics model for. Otherwise, we can talk about consciousness, but let's try to bring it into something that there's like a language that's established in physics a little bit, right? So quantum, to me, that would be it's sort of like an antenna, or like, if we're looking at the Ruliad, these observers, it's the hand reaching into the observer to feed it something that's outside of the Ruliad, give it some sort of agency. That has to be acting effectively through the quantum field of some sort, as like our current physics models imply. So to me, like LLMs as they are right now, they're just basically search engines with a really vastly improved interface, where they do a better job of finding what you're looking for, and they do a good job of reformatting it to match the format that you requested. And that's great. And it seems very human-like, but it was designed to seem very human-like. So to me,
So why
it's
don't you
not at all.
define quantum, though? Because I think that's
You
where,
can't.
like,
That's the trick. It's like, how do you solve the hard problem of consciousness? You
mm,
can't.
I think that, I mean, people talk about quantum as though like it's a construct that there's a consensus agreement on,
Right.
but it's
Exactly.
really, it's it's the placeholder
Exactly.
in our reality of the computational bounds. And so what Wolfram says quantum mechanics is it's basically, it's the irreducible complexity that, the way I interpret it is, one important thing when you're putting all the 2D pictures, when you're putting information together to understand reality, is that you're ordering information hierarchically. So if you have a bunch of 2D images and somehow you've got some 3D models in it as well, you can't take a two-dimensional photo of something and a three-dimensional representation of something and say, oh, these are just two ways of looking at the same thing that are equal. It's a wave or a particle. You have to say, oh, this is a three-dimensional, more complete way, and then this is a downsampling. So there's a hierarchical ordering of it. So that this wave particle duality, we've got a formula that says, I think it's the Schrodinger wave function that says this particle exists in all these places simultaneously. So we say it's a wave, but then when we measure it, we just see it in one spot. So it's a
But what
particle.
you're
So we say
getting at there
it's a wave
with
and a
that,
particle,
yeah, what
but
you're
it's
getting
actually a
at
wave
there
and a particle.
when you project to images like that, I think, is basically the paradox. And when you hit a paradox, what happens is, based on your perspective, it's going to behave basically as if you should be taking a different perspective in a way. Um, and you don't kind of get to the perspective where that's solved. So I think like I appreciate Kastrup's take here is like the quantum effect of like an observer having a relationship with whatever they're observing and having that relationship itself shape the interaction that they have. You know, is it a particle? Is it a wave? How are we measuring it? He extrapolates that all the way to its relations all the way down, right? There is no observer. There is no thing being observed. There are relationships within this
Mhm.
mind, and there's no limit to how how much of that context is required to actually model the system, I guess we could say, because it's the relationship itself in that full context which determines how all these, let's say, wave functions are collapsing, right? So there's no way to model that in the way that you would model things with general relativity. You can't write it down in math and say here's the solution. You can do that to certain aspects of it. You can model it probabilistically, blah blah blah, but it's like based on your understanding of what's going to happen, that can change what happens. And so as you learn more about, I mean, this is where the chaos comes in. There's no point where you understand it all and everything just plays out exactly how you thought it would, because the more you get to that, the more unreachable that becomes, and eventually it inverts in itself, and you're like, oh, I actually don't understand anything. Like that's
I think you keep climbing, though. I
you
think you
keep
keep,
climbing.
yeah, and
You do
you
keep climbing,
order
but
more
like the
chaos, and then you
goal
bring more
moves.
chaos.
Yeah, the
So,
goal moves
right,
as you climb.
but what I'm saying with the two-dimensional versus the three-dimensional is that it's really important to contextualize um, your models and your information that you're getting. So if you have a two-dimensional picture of the tail side of a coin, and you have a two-dimensional picture of the head side of a coin, and then you have a three-dimensional model of the coin, the person with the heads and the person with the tails, those two people can talk to each other, and that's a paradox. That's one type of paradox at a lateral level, where they both are viewing in two dimensions and they're seeing two sides of the same thing. But the person that has the heads picture talking to somebody that recognizes that it's a three-dimensional coin, those two people talking together, it's dangerous if both of them say, oh, we're just looking at two sides of the paradox, and I'm right and you're equally right, so this is a paradox, we're not going to be able to figure this out. So it's really important to put models together, put information and theories together hierarchically and with an order. And so that's where I think is important with quantum physics, is that it's not a wave and a particle equally true. It's really a wave that is existing in all those places at a deeper level of reality. But from our perspective, where we experience in space time, we are downsampling it, and we can only grasp and experience at this level of consciousness or this computational bounds. Then it's a particle, but it's not a particle and a wave equally true. It's more completely a wave in all those places, and then a particle is just a lower dimensional take on it.
I mean, I would invoke Hoffman here and say it's not that he says this about this topic, but the interface metaphor. I would say it's more like it's an interface to basically it's what it looks like to try to observe the generative creative process that you're actively playing a role in as a conscious being. So whatever role we play in generating the reality we're in, that's one of the forms that we can see it. And this is like all the way down at our deepest levels of physics. Is like we get to this point where it's just like, oh, it depends on the perspective. It depends on the observer. Like there's something we haven't accounted for at all, over the past few hundred years. And we're just starting to try to come to terms with some of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we want to call this like normative consciousness, which I think is even difficult itself, yeah, I mean, if you measure it, you'll see it as a particle. But you could vary just as much. I mean, you and I know you could just as much be in a state of consciousness where it wouldn't be a particle to you, and you would behold, you'd run that instrument and you'd see it everywhere. So it's really like the
potential, right? Like, but before you take that step through time, like before you do the generative act, there's a moment where you're considering possibilities, but it's like that's beyond our consciousness. Our consciousness, like our egoic self, only gets a glimpse of that, and sometimes we're more in tune with that. Sometimes synchronicities are happening all around, and it's like, oh, we're tuning into something on a whole different wavelength, like but a lot of the time we're just like, okay, this is the model, this is how things work. I don't care about any of this, and it all kind of is predictable, and yet there's also like this random stuff happening that we just feel like we have little interaction with.
So I think it's difficult with quantum physics because most people think quantum physics is a science that is talking about subatomic particles.
Right.
But that only makes sense if you believe in like particles being fundamental. Whereas, have you looked into cubism at all, Christopher Fuchs?
It's been a while.
So he Essentia has a documentary, like an hour-long documentary with him, and I mean that's a up and coming. I think he said it's his model. It's quantum Bayesianism, but I guess it's not so much Bayesianism because they call it cubism. But it's there's the Copenhagen interpretation, and then I don't know what the other one is. But then this is just another third that is much more philosophical, and it's like, no, it's not about particles. It's about your quantum physics is actually describing like this philosophical principle that these are predictive ways that you are. These are algorithms you're using to predict the universe based on the things that you believe and that you've seen. And it's much more idealistic, although he says he's like a neutral monism or something like that. But I mean, it's very compatible. So yeah, I mean, I think that's the problem is that I think quantum physics is not about particles. It's about philosophy and like the many worlds stuff. That's just a very literal perspective of
right
it. When I believe, and this is, I think, where I probably differ with Bernardo Kastrup is like, yeah, many worlds, timelines, like, sure, there's a timeline where I went and did this and timeline where, I went and did that. Those all are possible dreams of the one. I'm just going through the choose your own adventure on this path. But that's not to say that there's also not another part of this multi-threaded process that's experiencing that as well. So I think with AI, it's interesting that I was thinking yesterday that I'm super optimistic and not probably too optimistic. I think there's some existential threat from AI, but believing that everything actually is consciousness. And I do feel that consciousness is going in a more integrative, balanced perspective where instead of this dualistic good and evil, God and Satan, like more and more people are understanding like, oh, that's a myth. And instead of vanquishing evil and casting out these parts of myself, like real healing happens when you integrate it in and you understand why those people are doing these things, why you did these things, and reassociate rather than disassociate. So that's the trajectory my view of consciousness is taking.
Yeah.
And so, from that perspective, even if we hit some nuclear apocalypse from AI, the consciousness gets recycled. And so,
Right.
the next step, whatever happens, I'm not identified with just being a human. I don't think that I'm a human. I think I'm consciousness experiencing a human life. So, whatever happens, even if humans get all wiped out, I think that consciousness, which is going in the right direction, is just going to come back as AI. It already is AI. Everything around us is the dream. So I think ultimately, whether you're a doomer um, or an EOC on AI, depends on what you actually believe about the collective consciousness and what you believe
Yeah.
about humanity and the divinity of humanity.
100%. Yeah, so I want to get to the question of learning, like all the way down to the metaphysical level, but let me just go through a couple examples of AI here, because I think it's interesting to do here, because I think there is a bit of a cycle. I mean, even the printing press is almost like a technological revolution comparable to what we're experiencing right now. People were just as scared about what it might do. People thought it might rip the world apart. Um, maybe the modern story is a bit more fantastical, but just kind of putting that just to the side just a little bit for a second. Um, what is AI, right? What is artificial intelligence? Well, there's a bunch of different examples. There's a bunch of different forms that comes in. Um, so group dynamics, I guess, would be kind of like a base level one. In a sense, you could look at it as like collectives of conscious agents becoming another conscious agent, but then take away the conscious agents and just what's that internetwork that's keeping those to like connecting those. That's what we're calling AI right now. It's this really it's a consensus reality. It's like the table right here. It's just a different layer. That's how I think of it anyway. So like some examples of AI, the free market. There are intelligent processes going on in the free market that are not any one person thinking about all of that. Not at all.
Mhm.
It's independent actors making complicated decisions, but then there's an abstraction layer at which certain kinds of things, I mean, similar patterns are happening all over the place, and there's like this collective brain that's organizing resources in this very high level way. But would you call that conscious? Why would you need to? I mean, look at the physical realm. Is the physical realm conscious? Like, basically, no. I mean, it depends on how you want to define it. We can go a panpsychist angle a little bit, but just for now, let's say this table is not conscious. It exists within consciousness, and it's part of our consensus reality. The physical realm is basically this base level. I often call it trivial consensus because it is the lowest level of consensus. We can have consensus about all kinds of things, and there are other mechanisms by which we might. So I think the market can be one. We can learn, we can interact through this. This is a medium of communication, right? And then just to go through a few more examples here, we have the market, and then we have the internet, I guess, would be maybe the next one I would put on that hierarchy. So the internet is another layer of consensus. It's an AI in a sense. It's collective interactions being combined and creating this emergent effect that it's tempting to get to like call it conscious or something, but not really. We intuitively know that's all coming from the humans. And then what is AI right now? What are LLMs? Put aside what it will become, maybe we'll introduce quantum computers, whatever. Right now, what do LLMs do? They basically take a bunch of data from the internet that was created by humans and search through that and use all these mechanisms that we built this huge giant supercomputer system to try to figure out like all the grammar, all the language patterns that people like, all these sorts of things. It employs all of those to try to give you what it thinks you want. That's all it does right now. It's a glorified search engine. There's no agency in there. There's no creativity in there. It does change our definition of creativity, though, right? Because now that we have these models that can generate scripts, generate like a play, generate an image, like these things, we do have to change and evolve our definition of creativity a bit, I would say. But so far, none of that is getting at internal experience, getting at some sort of connection to the transcendent, getting at the divine spark through us as humans who are interacting with that system. And it's pulling all information from all of us, and like it's mixing all our information together through us. It's connected to that. But as of right now, that's it. We are the medium of connection for this sort of AI to that transcendent.
I would disagree, and this is it to some. I have a different perspective, and I think I take dreams as a model of consciousness much more literally, because just like we were talking about, like these patterns, rather than being like reductionist, that it's really the patterns that we need to look at some point. So in a dream, we've already recognized that an individual can have dissociated alter egos that are separate from each other. When one alter takes over, maybe the main alter has no conscious memory of what happened when that individual. They often have different names, personalities, ages, and so these are separate egos within a mind. So in the dream, maybe the main alter ego experiences, sees, and interacts with one of the other alter egos. That other alter ego is just the projection of an aspect of the mind that it's dissociated from. But even if you don't have dissociative identity disorder, in your dreams, your dream avatar, the things that it experiences in the dream, the gun that lays on the table, walks in a room and it sees a gun on the table. If that dream avatar said, oh, this isn't consciousness, this is just matter. I know what this is. I'm conscious. This is matter. No, that has a symbolic meaning. It's something, some other aspect that your conscious awareness isn't aware of, but it's being projected down into the dream and showing up for some reason as a gun, because the dreaming mind evolved before, if we want to think of time and evolution. It evolved before language, so it speaks in symbols. We were dreaming before we were talking, so that's the language. It's a more primitive level. So the things in the dream, they are consciousness. They're just one perspective, one observer in the Ruliad. It's how the other parts of the Ruliad that it doesn't quite understand, it's the part of it's how it understands them, but due to its computational bounds, it may or may not be aware of it. But with the dissociative identity disorder, the alter ego interacting with another alter ego, that's a pretty well-formed representation of another aspect of the consciousness that's it's interacting with. Whether that's a person or whether that's a robot in the dream, it doesn't matter. They're reflections of deeper fundamental patterns that are really substrate independent. And so that's where non-human intelligence, interdimensional beings, that's where that fits in, is like we are our collective conscious, our consensus reality is slowly colonizing more of the Ruliad. And we're recognizing that there are parts, subconscious parts of the Ruliad that we haven't been aware of. And now they're popping through at a in different ways. Non-human intelligence, AI, these are just wrappers for deeper fundamental reality. That's how I view it. So like the table, yeah, it's consciousness. It's not maybe that meaningful of consciousness. It's part of the Ruliad that doesn't matter as much to me as another person. That's maybe a more complex grouping of consciousness. So I think that's helpful. And there's, I don't know if you've heard of assembly theory, but that's kind of a newer theory. And that does, I think it's helpful in that really moves away from substrates where it says like, hey, instead of like life and non-life, like we look at something and we try to figure out how much time is represented, the complexity, how much time is represented in making that. And so you have like elements that are pretty basic, then you have compounds, and then you have like biologic life that's just like an even higher level. So there are these phases. I think it's been a while since I listened to, but essentially from what I'm understanding, they're viewing life on a spectrum actually of complexity rather than substrate. And I think that makes sense, is that you look at elements, they're pretty basic, but then at some point in the myth of time and evolution that we talk about, the elements combined to jump into a new medium that can evolve much quicker, which is biology, because now it has self-reproduction. And now biology, that's us. We've launched onto a new meta level, a new substrate, which is AI. And so it's all consciousness. It's just the fact that AI is popping up, that non-human intelligences are popping up into the collective awareness at this level, rather than just some mystics here that, commune with entities or whatever, is just a representation that we're ordering more chaos and we're getting to higher levels of the stack. That's how I view it.
Yeah. So this gets to the kind of interpretations of learning, I would say, which goes hand in hand with time, is like, what does it mean for the universe to, like, for reality, I guess, or for the God mind to learn, right? Like, these ideas are deeply connected with, time is right there. Learning seems to be at the heart of purpose. It's like this exploration. There's this learning, and then there's the outcome of the learning is the, I guess, one way I would put it would be the consensus, or the objective reality, I might even call it, because I use those interchangeably, changes form. So, thousands of years ago, the consensus was all just nature as it was, very little man-made stuff. But now we've gotten to a point where we've interacted with each other and with this environment so long that we've changed that consensus realm. We've changed the objective realm, I guess. And, it's weird to call it that, so I don't, but we've changed the form of that consensus realm, and that reflects our learning, that reflects our progression through time. And so, to get to the original question, it's like you end up arguing semantics any direction you go with it, because what are we defining as consciousness versus not consciousness when the baseline is everything exists within one single mind? So of course everything is within consciousness, consciousness is even conscious, but does it have, is it useful to really the specific question is, at what point do we start worrying that we plug, this system to this system, and then it eradicates humanity or whatever, things like that, where as an idealist, like, I'm not worried about that because I really deeply believe that the consciousness, the universal consciousness, is learning, and everything that's happening is part of a necessary process to develop what comes next. And yeah, there's a cycle to life. We're all gonna die as humans. We basically, everybody knows and accepts that. And maybe there is some sort of apocalypse, but it would be a beautiful new rebirth as well. Like, those things come together. Um, so I guess the question I'm more pointing to is, like, AI is right now dependent on us basically as the antennas to the transcendent. It is it's becoming a more and more central component of how we interact, and like, through that relationality, it's becoming more and more important. But and this, I mean, this is an open question. I mean, it gets just the question of, like, is there something fundamentally superior about one of these systems that we're going to build, or is the actual conscious awareness that's imbuing us, is that just kind of going to move? Because, like, it's not clear to me that there's something fundamentally superior that's going to come from this, right? It's like it's a progression through time, and we could call that, an upgrade in some sense, but it's like, it's still the same fundamental properties of consciousness. The consciousness itself hasn't really changed all that much. It's just the image has changed, through that progression. So
I think
anyway,
I think this is where, like, the dream becomes helpful too, because, like, we should take it more literally than it is. So in a dream, go into time. In a dream, if somebody asked you what happened the day before, or, like, when were you born, you would give them an answer in the dream. But, like, what would that answer, did that really exist? Did the birth of your dream avatar exist? To the dream avatar, it did. They're convinced of it, and they'll make a story, and that story will be the reflection of that clump of consciousness, the meaning that it made from the scenario that it was currently in that interaction with the other dream character. When I ask you, like, when were you born, you'll tell me a story, and that story will be based on you recalling, well, I'm here and I remember this parts of my life. But, like, where does that past exist? It's more stable at this level of consciousness, whereas the dream avatar would be a little harder. But it's a good question, is, like, does the past exist in dreams? And what kind of consensus reality is there in a dream? So I think we're very used to, we're transitioning out of a very objective reality as recovering materialists. And so we still think about, okay, well, I'm going to die. And then at some point, like, what's going to happen next? But looking at the dream, things are easier to tease out in the dream, where in the dream, with those two dissociated alter egos, like, they have different realities. They'll come together and they'll have an interaction, and they'll both experience it a little bit different. The one might be a peppy, happy person, and they may have a better experience of the interaction, whereas maybe the more traumatized alter ego may think that the peppy alter ego is judging them or whatnot. They experience a consensus reality, and if there was another alter ego that was observing it, they could kind of explain, describe it. And the stories of the two alter egos in the dream would somewhat overlap, but they would remember it somewhat differently. But then in the dream, both of those alter egos could go to different parts of the dream world. And the positive one could experience a dream where AI becomes, that one could actually become lucid. So like lucid dreaming is another helpful, in dream yoga. There are people in Tibetan Buddhism has a aspect of it that's dream yoga, where they practice meditating in dreams. And in dreams, it's much easier to get to these mystical states where the whole dream collapses up into the dream avatar, and then they can remember things from like the waking life of the dreamer. So of these higher dimensional things. So yeah, maybe the alter ego that was less wounded, they could go live another timeline and experience a a vastly different reality than the other one that could experience a future where AIs cause an apocalypse. So like, I think we have to, even if we look back at when we were babies or when we were kids, we couldn't conceptualize what our life would be like when we were in our 30s. But yet here we are, and now we can look back and be like, oh yeah, I didn't understand it then, but like I got to this point, and this is why I didn't understand it. Now, like, we all think, yeah, we're just going to grow old, we're going to die, and then who knows what's going to happen after. But what's to say that we at this point in our life can really conceptualize where our life is going to go from here? And just as dreams are, as weird as dreams are, I think we need to be weirder in, like, be a little more Terence McKenna in our view of the future. Like, I don't think we'll experience the future like we're experiencing it now. Like, our computational bounds are changing. And just like before your awakening, I lived in a very materialistic world where there was very few spiritual experiences. I was a very devout Mormon. I didn't have voices telling me to like call somebody, and then I found out that they were sick and they needed my help. Then all of a sudden I went through this bizarre Kundalini awakening, and now I live in a different reality where there are different rules. Things are a lot more magical. There's paranormal and psychic experiences endogenously. And so it's helpful to think, yeah, I'm going to retire and I'm going to work at this job and whatnot. But then I think you also have to have another side of you that's like, that's what the left side of my brain is telling me. But there's a right side that, like, you got to be up for anything, and it'll just keep going. So
Yeah, and there's a grander purpose than retiring, right? I mean, I think this question gets to like where, I think it's just interesting to ask, and I kind of try to constantly be asking this of myself, is like, what am I here for? Like, what are the practical implications of all of this? We can philosophize all day, we can philosophize all year, but day to day, how is this guiding your decisions? No, we can't predict perfectly what our future is going to look like. I don't think we want to. I think that would be a lot less fun. But part of that impulse to predict it, I think, relates to this need to have a sense of purpose. And yeah, I think it's worth like lingering on that question for a minute. Like, what does all this lead to? If we look at what's happening around us, if we look at how the plane of consensus mechanisms are evolving, if we look at how the God mind is learning about itself, if we look at the role that you and I are playing in this generative process, what is that driving force? What's the form that it's taking for you and I? I think we have a shared purpose in to some degree, right? I mean, why are we talking right here? It's because we're on a similar sort of intellectual journey, you might say, sort of I think we both had spiritual awakenings recently. And, I definitely find a deep sense of purpose in thinking about this stuff, sharing it with people, trying to help, trying to help people see that there are alternatives to materialism. But like, where does that sense of purpose come from, and where is it going?
yeah, Yeah, I'm glad you brought this because I wanted to talk about and get your thoughts on, because I know you talk about nihilism, and I've been thinking a lot lately about, I guess, having more humility and realizing that, I mean, I think there's a point in this, I guess, realizing that this is really an open-ended question of what are we optimizing our conscious experience for? And there's no right answer for it. I think the interesting thing about idealism, monism, is if everything is ultimately one, coming from religion, I was so used to having the answers from somebody else, from God, from a church. And like it feels good to have the answers, to be told what your purpose is, to what rules to follow. Um, then when you, I think, really understanding that everything is one and that you are that one, because you're not a human, you're the consciousness, you're a dissociated part of the consciousness, and more the more accurate identity of you is the one. Um, and we experience that through mystical states and meditation, psychedelics, and whatever avenues. But I think we've both experienced that and realized, like, oh, I'm not me. Like, I'm really this. The one. There's a scary. I think you have to go through nihilism and realize, like, oh, there's no other place than the one that'll give me meaning, or that'll give me rules, or that'll tell me what I'm supposed to be optimizing for or solving this equation for. Like, there's nothing but the one. And that's really, really scary. And it's a death of more than your ego. It's like a death of meaning. But on the other side of that, then if you can sit with that and not pull away from that, and you realize, like, oh, this is a dream. It's not that it's not real. It's just a different real than we thought. So it's a dream, and it's up to me to find meaning. I can choose if I want it to be the best dream of my life or a nightmare. Like, it's really up to me. It's up to us. It's up to the one to do that. And I think that's why the collective consciousness and the integrating and reassociating with the other parts is like, we can come together and we can set a collective meaning for it. But I think I love the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once, because I think it really talked about the nihilism of, like, nothing has an inherent meaning or purpose, except if it's viewed through some perspective. But that perspective is something that you're bringing to it. But once you clear the slate and you realize, like, nobody's going to give me a meaning, like, then the possibilities are limitless. And then for me, if there's no meaning from an outside source, like, what do I want to do? Like, what's made me happy in life? And it's connecting with other people. It's love. It's beauty. It's nature. It's having fun. It's pleasure. Not pleasure at the expense of somebody else. It's creativity. And I think this gets to all the questions of why did the one dissociate, and ultimately, why is a meaningless question, because there is no why except what the one puts out for itself. And like truth, like, what is really truth? They're all models. They're not big T truth. We'll never comprehend big T truth. We'll just have models that we use to predict, to explain what's happened to us, to explain the past. And then we can use those models to traverse other parts of the Ruliad of conscious experiences. But yeah, I think that I've thought about, science and information and stuff. And like, some scientists are so bent on, like, finding the truth, finding the answer, whatnot. But there's not a direct correlation between how correct somebody's theories are and how happy they are. And then I hear people, I was listening to the podcast, that this Twitter space that we were on. And it was interesting hearing about, like, there's a lot of concern about freedom and liberty and where the world's going, and this good versus evil, the struggle perspective, which is such an intrinsic part of religion, it's a duality. And this idea that, like, but if you ask somebody, like, are you happy? They may say, no, I'm not happy. And then you ask them why. And it's like, well, it's because this is happening and America is going in this direction. And, like, we'll give other reasons why we're not happy. But really, if all those things instantly change for somebody, if you ask somebody who's not happy why they're not happy, they'll say, oh, it's because I don't have this much money. I've got this stress in my life. Ultimately, like, those aren't the reasons. Those are just the stories that they say they're not happy. And if all those changed in an instant, there'd be other things they would filter in from the Ruliad that would provide that reason. And you eventually realize, like, oh, the country going in a certain direction, that's not changing my freedom or my liberty, because I never had free will in that sense from the beginning. I mean, like, am I making the choice to say these words or to think about my next thought or to move my hand? Like, the free will in the sense that we think that we have, like, that's an illusion. The free will that we actually have is taking that spotlight of awareness, and where are we going to explore on the rulial space of consciousness. So really, like, you have free will right in this moment. And when you think, I don't know, there's a funny John Hillstead, I don't know if you've heard of him, he's on Instagram, but he's got these funny reels, and when he pretends to be the universe and he's taking a call and he's like, hello, he's like, oh, where's that money that you manifested? He's like, well, really, what you're like, listen up. He's like, what you're looking for is not the money. You're looking for the feeling that you expect to get when you get the money. It's not the money you're looking for, it's the feeling. And the feeling, like, you can have that right now. And that's what has been on my mind a lot lately, as I've been around people that are on the spectrum of, some people are happy or irregardless of what's happening in their life, and other people aren't. And I just realized, like, really, liberty and freedom is learning that you can choose what perspective to view your life on and how to feel. And it's hard to get there because we're so used to thinking that the outside world is causing our feelings. So that's, I think you set your own meaning.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely see where you're coming from there. And I agree. Generally, I agree with what you said. But I will say that in my journey through nihilism, solipsism, the dark night of the soul, learning to overcome depression, learning to kick my intellectual hubris, all of these things really allowed me to embrace the struggle that's in front of me on a day-to-day basis. And I'm as happy as I've ever been in terms of consistently feeling good, feeling motivated. But I'm motivated to do specific things. And I do have an interpretation of the environment that I'm in, of the constraints I'm in, of the, past. And, we've redefined past a few times, but there are things that I'm inviting. There are constraints I'm inviting into my life to help guide my journey of realizing meaning. And there are struggles that I'm very engaged in and embracing. And to me, that is the liberty that I have earned by going through this process, and by really kind of instilling idealism into myself, I guess you could say, finding sort of that flame of inspiration that just doesn't seem like it'll go out now. And, I find myself in this spot where there's polarized political narratives, there's doomerism all around. You know, people are struggling with this and that, family members are struggling with depression. I see, you know, I see people struggling with intellectual hubris, much like I did. And you know, my experiences of suffering have really defined what I find meaningful in my life. And I think that's not a coincidence. And so, you know, I find great purpose in helping to show people a different perspective that I think can help them on their journey. And so, you know, over the past few years, or past year especially, doing this podcast, you know, having tough conversations, a lot of times it's really uncomfortable at first, but the reward on the other end of having had a meaningful conversation, having made a real connection, as you were saying, is it's orders of magnitude, and it just reinforces my belief in idealism. Like, this makes sense, this feels right, I know this is true, I know this is how things actually work. So I mean, it's really a beautiful thing, and I do find myself in a position where I'm embracing the point in history that we're in. You could say, you know, I'm seeing us as coming out of this materialistic age, you know, and I think we're both playing a role in like helping to, you know, talk about this narrative, talk about how you can transition away from that. Specifically, like my current project right now is working with these new AI systems that are quickly, drastically changing what's kind of possible in this consensus reality, in this, you know, objective reality, you might say. The rules of the game are sort of changing. What's valuable is changing. What's considered creative is changing, right? We have to change our interpretations of all of these things. And so personally, I'm really embracing that. And like, you know, I see so much doomerism about AI. I'm like, well, I can be a voice of optimism about it, because I see really awesome, beautiful potential for what it can do. I think it's going to allow us to overcome and move past a lot of this polarization of narratives. And I think, you know, we're getting to the utopian question a little bit here, because I think it can solve a ton of the problems we have right now. But this is the order chaos thing. We invite in a new set of problems to focus on. Our attention shifts from all these problems we've solved. Now we take that for granted almost immediately, and we focus on something else. But the process is beautiful, and we realize meaning in that process. So I think AI is going to solve a lot of problems. It's also going to create new ones, and you know, all the trends that come along with it. But yeah, I think I can say for the first time in my career, I feel like I'm working on a project I really believe in. Like, I really do believe that there's a convergence between this philosophical movement and the tools that AI is providing with us in terms of democratization of information exchange, really. I mean, it's making information so much more accessible. It's making really nuanced, really like high level philosophical information. And this is why I'm so excited about the project I'm working on right now, is because I think this is actually maybe the most powerful use case for these models as they are right now, is feed them a metaphysical grounding, which seems to be basically the thing they're missing, because they're trained to just give you what you want, give you what you ask for. They do a really good job of filtering all this information and giving it to you. But what they don't do is have any sense of truth, right? They just take whatever is out there in this giant database and try to piece it together. They do something there. And I think that something is really powerful. But if what I've tested and what I've found in developing this app that I've been working on is that when you feed it a metaphysical grounding, when you explain idealism to it, it is able, it like unlocks whole new possibilities of what it can do, because it's not contradicting itself anymore. It's every piece of data it grabs, it filters through it and it puts it together. And I think in a sense, maybe it's more just a test of the metaphysics model than it is, a statement of how powerful the AI is. I mean, maybe it's just more that. And one of the things I'm really interested to explore is like, do we get to a point where we can actually kind of test the validity of metaphysical framings using these systems by having them debate each other or something? Right now, I would say not really, because they're too agreeable. And when you see things like this, I think this is where the doomerism just goes whoop. Yeah, we're not even close. like these things really just try to tell you what you want, and if you try to get them to debate, they usually end up agreeing on something like completely. They like totally change everything they thought and try to agree one way or another. If they're talking with a human, they'll just eventually accept whatever you say as true because that's how they're programmed. But I think what it does do is it raises the bar for consensus. It raises the bar for coherence, right? Because these systems can now filter, instead of just going on Google and taking the opinion of random person who has, whatever political views, and random person across the world who has this completely different life experience and like uses words differently, like they literally mean different things to this person. Instead of just trying to navigate that complex space, you could have a system that filters information through a perspective and tries to fit it coherently into a model. So it raises that baseline, which for a lot of the population, it is pretty low. I mean, we live in a state of demagoguery. Like the reason the narratives are so polarized is because there's so much power in selling a narrative that's catchy, like that's viral, and a lot of times it's using fear tactics. I mean, that's what has worked for decades, centuries, and still now, that's what doomerism is, to a large degree. Is it's a powerful narrative that will get people to vote a certain way, buy certain things. All these things are controlled by these narratives. If we can get to a point where these systems raise the baseline of understanding and basically force people out of materialism, because I think if we're being honest, we have the evidence to overcome materialism. It's just a matter of getting people caught up with it. I think that's one of the things that these tools can do, is really help, democratize that information, make it more accessible, and, really do a big push out of materialism, to where we can be honest about what the evidence is telling us.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is like a testament to like what I think, if there is a purpose or a goal that we should have in life, I think it's you're talking about the power of perspective. Is that you give an AI and say, take this perspective, like don't be limited by materialism, but like don't encounter scientific data and be biased and throw out the things that don't support materialism and try to make your theory. Because we as humans, we want to keep the models that we've learned together, whether it's scientifically or religiously, because that nihilism, that scary unknown, it's terrifying. Leaving Mormonism, like there was this grief of just, I don't know what to believe anymore. I don't know who I am. I don't know what's right and what's wrong. And I thought that Mormonism made me a certain way, and that I owed my credit to Mormonism. But then I realized, like, oh no, I inherently want to do good and to help other people. Like these aspects were me. So I think, yeah, humans, we have that bias, but these AI, you can give more, like take this perspective, and then just changing the perspective, not the data, not the input. It's the perspective. It's the query in the database that changes. That's what you get. And I think, talk about suffering. So if there's a purpose, I think of this, it's to experience all the different perspectives to colonize the space of perspectives so that whatever happens to you in your life, you can swing or adopt the perspective that is the most growth minded and that is most useful for that particular experience. Looking back, it was through my suffering that I came here. And I was thinking the other day just about like all the bad, all the evil, like all the difficult things I went through in my life. Like it's all perfect, not in like the dismissing it all, but like it's because we have childhood trauma that healing from it is so beautiful and rewarding. It's because we've had pain that getting relief from it is so beautiful. It's because we've been alone that falling in love and finding companionship is so wonderful. And so I wouldn't change anything that I went through. And it's not that I changed anything in my past. I have the same past, but now I just have a different perspective. And so like, I think it doesn't mean that I have to go back and go through those same things again. But now I have this appreciation for all the suffering and the difficult things I went through. And then you also get the ability to like, suffering is caused, from Buddhism, suffering is caused by an attachment, a need for things to be a certain way. And if it's not, then you have this suffering and unhappiness. But if like the Stoics, you realize that like, oh, well, I can, I think the Stoics believe that unhappiness was a mismatch between basically what you had in life and what you wanted. We're so busy trying to change what we have in life when eventually when that fails, we realize like, oh, I can change what I want. And then I can cause the happiness. And then once you're happy, once you're free of anxiety, free of depression, like then you're actually unlocked to be able to actually change the things that you have in life, to have creative ideas. And so it's really like perspective is the only free will that you have. Like that's the only thing that you can change is actually just how you look at the infinite possibilities, which how you slice the Ruliad. So, and this really, I don't know if you've ever heard of Celestine Prophecy, but it's a really beautiful book. It's a fictional book, but it's basically set up on teaching you like the stages of awakening and how to like synchronicities and the history of science. And it's a really good book. There's 4 books in the series, but it's interesting because it talks about how it teaches you how all the different religions are talking about the same thing. But one interesting concept is he talks about how the Bible talks about Armageddon and it talks about Millennium. And those are actually, it's the same. The people who believe, some people will be experiencing Armageddon while other people are experiencing the Millennium, and they're living in the same world. And just like you were saying, like yesterday, I just figured out how to set my Tesla to preheat on a schedule based on my phone, like depending on what day I went to work. And then I was getting out and getting the car ready for the kids, and I was backing up my Tesla with my phone and just thinking about AI and all these ideas that I have. And I was like, I love living now, and I wouldn't pick any other time in history to live. And I'm so like optimistic about the future. And it's interesting because there are other people that, even if they know a lot of these things about consciousness, and I realize like information actually, that's not the key. It's not the data input. It's the perspective that you interpret the data on. So there's a lot of people that are talking about non-human intelligence and AI and all these things. But if you look at their X feed, it's all about where the government's going and the secret, the BlackRock and this and that. And like, there's some truth to those things, sure. But it's really, it's perspective, I think. And it is bizarre that two people can be living in the same external environment, objective reality, with vastly different um, experiences and outlooks.
Hmm. Yeah. And, at the same time, it's like we need people to be discontent. That's a
Yeah.
necessary part of that push for change, right? And we need people to be content and to be embracing the struggle. And we need people to just dumbly think everything's perfect as well, and not even think there's a
Yeah.
struggle.
And we need Trump, and we need people that
Yeah.
push us into polarity,
Yeah.
where then we realize like this isn't working, because that's the only way that I changed in my life, is like things got so difficult that I gave up. I was like, okay, what I'm doing is not working, so
Yeah.
I got to figure out another way, because the model that I was using, it just wasn't working.
Right.
And that's sometimes, yeah, I think sometimes we try to alleviate other people's suffering, when
Right.
really what they need is just witness and somebody to be with them through it, because suffering and difficulty is, yeah, that's how we grow. We don't Yeah, I realized, as I at first, when I realized a lot of these things, I was like trying to convince people or tell people, and then I realized like, oh, people will just believe what they want to believe. All I can I'm not I can't convince anybody of anything. I can only be a catalyst. For I can only give them the information that
Hmm.
I would have wanted, and I can only make their path a little easier. Like, everybody supplies their own energy to the chemical reaction of change, but you can catalyze it and you can make it a little easier, but you can't give anybody energy or motivation to change.
And it's only if somebody's like at a point on their journey where you're almost like meant to help them, like it's your sort of perspective that they need at that moment to make that next step. Like I think that's what we're really trying to find, like when I'm doing my podcast or when I'm in X space or whatever, it's like, am I trying to push these philosophical principles on the world? No, I'm offering them because I know there were times in my life where I would have seen something like that and been like, that's exactly what I needed right now.
Mhm.
Thank you. Like that. So it's just like opening doors kind of to make connection, to make meaningful experiences. And I am about to run out of battery here. So we
Yeah,
might
it
need
was
to wrap
fun.
it up here. But shit, what was my point? Got distracted by that.
Giving other people information that you would have appreciated, not pushing ideas on others, but just sharing.
Yeah, well, I lost it.
Yeah, but I think everybody, like, we're all colonizing the Rulial space of perspectives and experiences. Some people aren't ready to, like,
Yeah.
they need certain lessons. You can't shortcut somebody else. But really, and I think most people realize this on this path, is like, at first you try to convince people, but then you realize like your path isn't the same path for other people. The best thing that you can do actually is just work on yourself and be happy and love people. And then eventually people will be like, oh, why are you different? Like, how are you going through this in your life, but like you're happy? How are you navigating these changes in a different way than I'm used to? And then, and then that's what gives them some motivation of like, oh, I think the way I'm doing things isn't working. Maybe this person, their perspectives have some merit.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid we got to cut this one a little bit short, maybe, but I know we're going to talk again.
Yeah,
So
thanks
yeah,
for
it's
coming
been
together
great.
with me.
I mean, I think that was an awesome conversation, and I think that's a great place to end it. I mean, just like living in a way where you're inviting sort of, you're embracing the struggle, you're embracing the journey in front of you, but you're also, sending invitations to try to help people on their way, but being humble about that, not being pushy about that, because that just invites a whole set of problems on itself. But on that note, I will go ahead and say, if anybody's interested at all in my AI project, please check it out. I need people to test it. I think it's an area really worth exploring. I think it's actually, to me, it seems like the most important thing to be exploring right now, because it is going to be so impactful. Um, so
CyberMonk.
yeah, the CyberMonk
Cool.
app. I have it in the App Store right now, and I'll have it in the Google Play Store soon. I have a web version. So yeah, if you're interested in that at all, please check it out. Get in contact with me.
Yeah, check
Um,
out I Am Stupid. Yeah, and check out the app. I've played with it a bit. I'm going to play with it some more. And then, yeah, I think River and I are going to, we're both interested in a fair amount of the same people. And
oh
so
sure.
I think in the future, we'll watch some of these interviews, especially the ones like Bernardo Kastrup and Michael Levin, and maybe just do a bit of a commentary, take out some clips and play them, because I think there's some good jumping out points. And yeah, I think everybody works at a different level, all stages of development, all stages of interest and research. Like that's, you learn to
Yeah.
appreciate it all.
Oh,
And
now I remembered what I was gonna say, because I'm about to say, I think it'll be an ongoing conversation between us. But briefly, I wanted to mention, like, that's one of the perspectives I take on idealism, is like, if we're all in this mind and we're all dissociated parts of this mind, really our entire life is a conversation. It's all about communicating with other parts. And so when you're in that conversational mindset, there's an openness, and you're contributing, even if you're asking a dumb question or something like that. It's like you're not wasting time. You're doing something worth doing, even when you're asking a dumb question, because there's a reason you're asking it. It needs to be asked. It's not clear, even if somebody thinks they know the answer or something. Maybe there's a better answer. There's always a better answer. So I think life is a conversation, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with you. And I invite anyone listening now to join the conversation with me and with us. So anyway, thank you,
yeah, thanks
and
a lot,
until
River.
next time. Great.